We have been looking at a lot of different thinkers on argumentation so far in the semester, and now we're past the halfway point, believe it or not, in the shortened semester, and we're going to start to get into some different conceptions of argumentation. So for the next few talks, we're going to be talking about people who are offering different views of argumentation from different perspectives, and the first person I want to talk about is Kenneth Burke. One of the readings that I have selected for the argumentation course is from Kenneth Burke's book, Philosophy of Literary Form, The Virtues and Limitations of Debunking, which is an essay, probably one of the few that Burke actually makes about argumentation. So we're going to get into this essay and talk about it in this video. As always, you can ask me questions on Discord, or you can put questions in the comments here, and I'll do my best to answer them. Kenneth Burke it's hard to overstate his influence in the study of rhetoric. But what about his study in argumentation? Well, he doesn't really get cited that much. Kenneth Burke was an American autodidactic scholar. It's a picture of him later in life, and probably at his home in New Jersey, where he lived, who was a critic, literary critic, art critic, music critic, wrote a ton of different stuff. He wouldn't make it in today's university. He's not specific enough. He's not enough of a precise kind of expert. You know, everyone's hyper specialized in the university today. Burke wasn't this way. He wanted to write about everything, and what he was trying to do in all his books and essays was trying to give us tools to avoid physical, material violence and conflict. He thought all of this could be solved through perspective, through words, through speech, through literature. He came up with a theory of this, dramatism, a theory to explain all of human motivation that he talked about we could learn from theater and from novels, from literature, from poems, from plays. Instead of thinking that theater mirrored the world mirrored theater. So he kind of reversed it a bit. He wrote about a ton of different topics, and he was always very attentive to words and how they function. And that's what this essay kind of deals with is, well, how does one make a good argument if you are critiquing something? So is he offering a theory of argument like some of the other writers? Probably not. He might be, but his essay is about a thing called debunking, which he doesn't like. So when you read this, there are certain questions that I'd like you to be able to speak about, or it might make it easier to talk about these things if you think about it in terms of these questions. What is debunking? So we'll hopefully be able to answer that at the end of reading the article. What does Burke think argumentation is? And what's the solution? Or maybe we should say, instead of what's the solution, like, how do we avoid debunking? Because he's going to say it's bad. Or what practices can we take for good argumentation from this essay? So these are maybe three questions we could look at as hopefully that we'll be able to answer, that you'll be able to answer by the end of us going through this. I'm going to bring this screen back up in a minute, but I thought we might go through some of the essay together in order to kind of understand it. So I don't want this video to be too long. I'm looking for maybe about half an hour, maybe a little bit longer as we go through the video, but the essay is quite dense. So we're going to try to get through it together, and I'll point out some of the things I think are most important as we go. All right, so actually, we don't need to do that. We can turn that off. Okay, perfect. So here's the essay. I should have probably turned the pages before I put it into the Canvas where you guys are probably getting it from. Hopefully that's not too... Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. I don't want to be too much in the way of the text. Let me slide over here. Easiest slide I've ever done in my life. Okay, so... Whoops. If I put myself small up here. Yeah, there we go. Now I won't really block the text too much, I hope, anyway. We'll see. I'm going to have to watch that, because as I move down, it might cause some problems. But I want to make sure that everybody can kind of read the text as we go. Yeah, I think I'll just maybe block down here and kind of focus in the middle here. So, debunking is a word that Burke is going to want to explore in this essay. So, the word debunking has gone into our language because it fills a need. It refers in general to that class of literature designed to show that George Washington did not cut down the cherry tree and the highly alembicated variants of such. It counters the inflating reputations by the deflating reputations. It is the systematic letdown that matches the systematic build-up. At one time in America, it went by the name of muckraking, which is a kind of journalism where you go and look for the worst kind of thing. You like go and scrape up the muck and try to bring in the bad part out of people who are successful. So think of it like kind of like sensationalist journalism today, where they're always looking for something bad that the people we admire that are famous have done. So then he talks about Bentham, and he talks about the Panopticon. And the Panopticon is a perfect prison where you put a tower in the middle where there are slats where it looks like people are looking at you if you're a prisoner. And the prisoners just have kind of an open wall, a glass wall. So they can be seen all the time from this guard tower. But they can't see into the guard tower, so they feel like they're being watched all the time. And the Panopticon was Bentham's model of a prison that wouldn't need guards because the prisoners would monitor themselves because they felt like they were being watched, because they don't know if there's anybody in the guard tower or not. So you could have one guard or no guards in there, and it would work fine. He says that this is symbolic of his attitude towards speech, which is that if we feel like we are being watched, maybe we will speak better or correctly, or avoid doing ill behavior, or maybe he could sit in a tower from his own constructions and look for that. Something like that. But debunking, as you can see in this sort of history of it, is this idea that if we are trying to build a kind of politics based on human nature, we would have to work very, very hard to use human nature to build up something good. And if you could do it on vice, it would be better, is what Machiavelli is saying. And then Hobbes built his on the brutish and nasty nature of people. So this is what debunking is like, that we are not necessarily good. We're actually more bad than good. Like for every good thing, you can sort of find that, no, it's not going to work. People are basically bad. People are basically liars. People are basically self-deceptive. This kind of thing. And that's kind of what Burke is saying that debunking is. The looking for the bad, or looking for the, well, none of that will work. And so he says, Adam Smith ends because Adam Smith says we can share greed in a way that benefits society, which he's referring to capitalism, right? The capitalism and the exchange that Adam Smith talked about. So once we began to question the church's vocabulary of human motivation, it gravitated towards the debunking category. So it's like this idea that as we talk about what people are good for, you say, no, people aren't good at that. You know, every time people do something charitable, it's really for selfish ends. Or every time that people, are people basically good? No, people are failing. Or like my favorite is like, man, people are so stupid. Why don't they just do what's right? Why don't they just vote for the right person? People are so dumb. Everyone's so dumb. Why don't they just realize this kind of thing? And this kind of attitude is the debunking attitude. So what Burke is going to do is he's going to look at a book by this guy Arnold, The Folklore of Capitalism, and use this as an example of debunking. And he goes into a lot of detail on this and everything. So, but here's the important part. This is the part I really want to go over with you, is this right here, which is one of the things that Burke says that debunking is. He says, I think the typical debunker is involved in a strategy of this sort. He discerns an evil, so it's something that he thinks is not good, wants to take care of through speech or writing. He wants to eradicate this evil, and he wants to do a thorough job of it. Hence, in order to be sure that he is thorough enough, he becomes too thorough. In order to knock the underpinnings from beneath the arguments of his opponents, he perfects a mode of argument that would, if carried out consistently, also not underknock the pinnings out from beneath his own argument. So this is like when people are like, man, people are so stupid. Why don't they just realize they need to do blah, 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 blah. So whatever you're saying that people are so dumb, or that people are too selfish, or we don't need X, you're doing such a thorough job of eradicating it that you have left no space for a countervailing position to arise. There's no, the thing that we could do instead that would be good doesn't really have a space or a place in the argument. So instead of consistently going on his own argument, he pulls his punch, meaning he hits but not as hard as he hit when he's going after the things he didn't like, and refuses to test his own arguments the same way. If anyone is to say tu quoque, you as well, which is a fallacy, it leaves it to his opponents to do so. And he makes the application of the tu quoque test more difficult for his opponents by unconscious subterfuges on his part, involving ambiguities that are hard to discover. In short, in order to shatter his opponent's policies, he adopts a position whereby he could not logically advocate a policy of his own. So if you say your opponent's policy is bad because of the nature of humanity or because of a particular way of thinking, and you say we should never, ever, ever think that way or approach that way, then you have removed any possibility of you being able to present your own policy and your own point. So then you have to covertly smuggle in something that you have eliminated overtly. So in the Arnold book, he realizes the ways in which discussion about principles have been misused in the current battles of words. Principles should be a guide to social adjustment, has been used as an obstruction to social adjustment. So in order to prevent the misuse, he ridicules the use. So instead of saying we should use principles properly, what Arnold does is he says, well, instead of we shouldn't use principles at all. Right? So this would seem analogous to the project of a doctor who would prevent heart trouble by getting rid of hearts. Right? This is kind of similar of like, well, if you just make something legal, then it's no longer a crime. Right? This kind of silly stuff. Or like one of the great ones that I hear all the time in my own life, since I'm a student of argument and I teach argument, is they say, man, if we could just get emotion out of argument, that would be fantastic. We would have so many logical and great arguments, and we would be able to like figure stuff out. Everything would be great. We wouldn't have to worry about people being illogical and going with emotion. But what's funny is you're kind of wishing away the entire motive for argument at that point, aren't you? Like, why would we argue at all if we were emotionless? Why would we care? We would just look at the data, look at the facts, and determine what the proper interpretation of that was. We wouldn't get, like, argument is predicated on that. So that's what debunking looks like, or debunking being like, man, I wish we could get rid of all these stupid voters who don't look to caring about other people. Instead, what we need are voters who, care about people. Okay, how do you determine that? It's kind of circular, right? It's kind of weird. So he just calls it, instead of principles, he just calls what he wants people to do in the book propositions. And then he goes on and on and on about this book, critiquing the book. And then we get to another part of debunking. These are the parts I really want you to pay attention to. Right? So here's another one here. Okay, so I've then suggested the first mark of the debunker, the fact that in order to combat a bad argument, he develops a position so thorough that will combat all arguments. So it might be all arguments in totality, but what if you were to make an argument about a way someone was doing something, like let's say tax cuts. You say tax cuts are the worst possible thing you could ever do. We never want to do that at all. And then you talk about a way of kind of putting money back into the economy by giving people payments or something. Well, you're sort of advocating for tax cuts, but it's by another name. Like you couldn't possibly say, well, tax cuts are okay in some conditions, but other ones, right? So the way I deal with this all the time in talking about immigration, which is an issue that I argue about a lot. I don't really understand why. I mean, I guess it's an issue we should all be concerned about because immigration is one of these issues that's fundamental and paramount to any society. How do we determine in a safe and reasonable way how many people can come and live here and work here and benefit from being part of the society? And on the extreme ends, you have people saying nobody should be allowed to come here, which I don't think anybody holds that position. And then everyone should just be allowed to come here freely and stay as long as they want, do whatever they want, as long as it's legal. And I think that's an extreme position that very few people hold. Somewhere in the middle, there's the idea of regulation of it. But I think if you say that immigrants are stealing our jobs, so you've made immigrants bad, so then you've eliminated the position of defending immigration at all, then you have to say, well, we want to protect good immigrants, legal immigrants. We want to allow them to come in. or we want people who are actually going to contribute to society to come in, or something like that. So this is the smuggling back. And it's not a good way of arguing, this kind of smuggling back and forth, because you never really get to the heart of what what an argument could do to advance the idea. So they throw something out by one name and bring it back by another name. So this is magical conversion, which is what he's talking about in the previous paragraph about the power of word magic, that argumentation is like poetry like this. Because you say, I don't want tax cuts, I want universal basic income. Or I don't want immigrants, I want hardworking people who value being part of society. Okay. Aren't those the same thing? Well, no, because you've changed it word-wise to avoid the burning down of your opponent's argument, which is a bad strategy. You can critique somebody's argument, Burke is saying, without debunking, because what debunking does is it just kind of makes a mess of everything and also eliminates space where people could find new kinds of ways of arguing that are revelatory to people. Let's move forward down to this next paragraph I've marked here. The situation calling forth this strategy has, of course, much to make us sympathetic with the strategist. Matches may be used either to light our pipes or burn down our houses, and one can well understand why, if they were being used almost exclusively for the purpose of burning down our houses, a thinker should arise to say, let us have no more matches. By preventing the use, he could prevent the misuse. And then, if he still had occasion to light his pipe, he might make an altered recommendation of this source. What we really need is lighters. Now, what's the difference between a lighter and a match? Well, in this case, matches are the bad instrument, and lighters would solve the problem of lighting pipes and lighting stoves and things, and not the danger of matches, right? You see there's a kind of a parallel here with sort of the handgun or gun debate in the United States, right? We don't need these kind of weapons. What we need is this. And people debunk them. I mean, I'm not saying that one side has superior arguments to the other one. It's kind of a mess. And it's a mess because the debunking strategy is what's used. He might go on to say that matches are largely derived from tradition, whereas lighters are modern. And in our eagerness for the solution, we might be willing to meet the thinker halfway, failing thereby to note that lighters could be misused in quite the same way matches are, or were. So he says, you might think this is an absurd example, but Arnold talks about administrative tribunals and talks about how administrative tribunals are somehow different than tribunals are more superior to courts because tribunals are new and they lack the ritual of courts. But the real issue is underlying conflicts. Whether courts or tribunals is a matter of conflicting interests, right? So instead of getting rid of the ritual, like getting rid of the way it's structured, the conflicting interests of the court would still be there. So if you get rid of the ritual of the thing, if you get rid of what we call it, you might still have the underlying problems, which is a problem with debunking as an argumentative strategy. Okay, so here's where he gets into stuff where he's writing in the 1930s, 1940s, late 1930s, and it sounds like he's writing about contemporary politics. In any event, we have at present a situation that makes us sympathetic with the debunker's efforts. For conservatives and reactionaries have developed a most disturbing strategy. It would seem that they are no longer bothering to seek good arguments, rather than content to seek any arguments. If only there are enough of them to keep running through the headlines, an avalanche of arguments, condemnations, prophecies of dire calamity, statistical proofs, pronouncements by private and institutional authorities, a barrage, a snowing under, a purely quantitative mode of propaganda. Are there no eagles among their publicized utterances? Very well, then let them be instead a swarm of mosquitoes. Before you could refute this morning's, there's a new batch out this afternoon. Anything, everything, if only it all points in the same general direction, a truly cynical exemplification of the slogan that in union there is strength, a kind of idealistic collectivism, a fabulous state of affairs whereby free speech is preserved only to be mocked at, the free speech that permits whispering no to a few friends and cronies while the loudspeakers blast forth a rousing yes for millions. This is very, very cool. So he's saying that debunking has arisen because of the way that argumentation has been shaped by the mass media. Right? So he says that conservatives and reactionaries just fill the media with stuff. And I think we see that today. It's just headline after headline after headline designed to get you aroused, to get you supportive and be like, yes, yes, instead of thinking through the more powerful arguments and the more like long form kind of arguments of reason of why their side on political issues should be supported. I mean, I would extend this to say that this is the problem. I mean, Burke had newspapers, and he's like, look, we're exhausted after the morning's headlines in dealing with those. then we have to get into the afternoon's arguments because there's just a swarm of them. They're like mosquitoes. It's not the eagles of arguments. It's the mosquitoes of tons of little arguments. And that's kind of what it's like to watch cable TV news. This is why I recommend to anybody interested in argumentation or studying words and rhetoric to stop watching cable news in entirety. Just stop. You're a university student, you're connected to a university, you have your choice of papers and journals to read around the world for free through the university. If you don't know how to do that, contact your university librarian and they'll show you exactly how to do that. For those of you who don't have that luxury, you want to pick 2 or 3 very different sources for news that's in print. It's slow. It's the Eagle. It lets you think a bit. It's a little bit better than the TV news. I mean, Burke is saying the newspaper's full of it too. He's right. But what we have to do is we have to appreciate the fact that the debunkers are trying to take down these arguments as quick as possible in order to open up a space for better kinds of arguments or to make sure the wrong thing doesn't get done. But I think that cable news is even worse than this. It's like something Burke probably couldn't imagine. He didn't really see he saw a little bit of the dawn of that. He died in 1993, so he saw a little bit of the dawn of CNN, but it's nothing like it is today, where there are 3 or 4 24-hour cable news channels that just spew quantitative propaganda at us about what to believe, what's true, proof, statistic, condemnation, prophecy, like endless talking heads. Here's what's going to happen. Here's why we're in danger. Here's the problem. Absolute nonsense, right? So, in this environment where you have, imagine, nowadays we only have like 1 or 2 papers, but imagine a world where you have as many newspapers as you do cable news. And this is Burke's world. There are tons of papers to look at. Seeing this, one has sympathy with the man who would work fast, seeking for some quick cure-all. Arnold's book is approached from this angle, something to be grateful for. As best, its very liabilities become its asset. It's because he does do picturesque work, particularly in confounding the output of the right, that group whose slogan, when confronting the Constitution, might probably be made to help, used to hinder. So the problem, though, is that Arnold is using ambiguity for effects, right? So he's talking about this book that we haven't read, and I haven't read, and it might not be the best example, but maybe we could come up with our own kind of example here, where he's saying that what people are trying to do against this onslaught of bad argumentation is to very quickly debunk it and say, no, that's wrong. People aren't like that. That's not going to happen, because that will never happen, because. So you have to have this kind of absolutist push, which is kind of debunking. You eliminate the conditions for the other side to even emerge as an argument. But then you've eliminated your potential to make your own kind of claim about the problem, because it's not like these arguments aren't addressing real issues that people face. So unfairness through ambiguity, I think he's talking about that. Why sit up all night worrying lest unfairness be treated unfairly? For unfairness does not only confound the enemy, it also may confound one's allies, since it may lead both sides into the wrong view of the situation. It might be satisfactory as mere vengeance, becomes more than vengeance, becomes a guide to its own right. As a guide, it is fallacious. So what does he mean by this? I think this section is where he's talking about that if you're confronting stuff with a quick cure-all, it might be seen as being okay to be unfair to a side of the political spectrum that might be being unfair in the construction of its own arguments. That is, they're just trying to overload and avalanche people with panicked causation, doomsday prophecies, statistics, naysayers, doom and gloom, all kinds of stuff that is going to prophesy bad stuff for the country. And people get very excited about that, and they think, oh my gosh, that's terrible. We got to act. We have to do something. And people might say, well, actually, it's much more complex than that. It's much more subtle than that. It's not as grim as they make it out to be. These kind of arguments might come out by people who want to address that kind of slew of argumentation. And I think that what he's saying is that sometimes we take shortcuts in our response to that, because we're like, well, they're being unfair, so we can be unfair right back. So they're being jerks, we can be jerks right back. And Burke is saying we have to be careful of that, because it's just vengeance. Just getting them back the way they got us is not good enough, because you're missing a guide to the situation, which is what's trying to be determined. So the approach isn't to hit back with something as hardcore as the propagandists hit with, but to hit back with a completely different approach, not to debunk it, but to do something else. And he's going to suggest what that is in a minute. So he goes into detail about Arnold's book here. And he's making gross caricatures to prove his point. So if you make too gross of caricatures of the different governmental figures who are working through things, right? So a given measure is not considered on the basis of whether or not it would take care of the problem at hand, whether or not it leads to regimentation, fascism, or communism, or destruction of the American system. By such amplification, or in Bentham's terms, censorious speech, practical issues are lifted to a moral plane that fills people with all sorts of irrelevant terrors. So you start to get concerned based on the response of what the other side might say. So Arnold makes these people into grotesque caricatures in order to combat their fear-mongering, I guess would be the word. So he says he's misleading us all by taking a debunking approach. So one side is sort of, doing this thing that is bad, and our initial reaction is to say, that is absolutely horribly bad and so terrible and wrong, and we should never do it. These people are idiots, this kind of argumentation. But that misleads all of us. So here's his example. I think it's a pretty good example. For instance, let's say you're to write a farce on mankind. Suppose you made up a composite character called Mr. Everybody, and you made this one character state all the divergent, mutually contradictory views held in real life by many different kinds and classes and ages of people. Mr. Everybody would obviously be the very opposite of the consistent, logical, or rational. He would be just a hilarious bundle of contradictions. So imagine a character who had everybody's views at once. He would not make any sense. That would be a crazy person. Now, in a way, it's just as much of a farce that this Arnold works up, though on a smaller scale. When being given an issue is debated in the press, many different people come forward with their interpretation of this issue. 20 different arguments by 20 different kinds of spokesmen may be offered, let's say, against packing the court, something that was relevant then, under FDR, and is relevant again now with the Trump-Biden election in front of us. Packing the court is an argument that's come up a bit. So this is absolutely relevant. So let's think about in terms of arguments about packing the court. And though all these spokesmen may agree on the proposition that the court should not be packed, right, people who are on sort of the conservative side of that issue, each may approach the issue from a different rationale. However, if you lumped all their arguments together as though they were to be taken as aspects of a single argument, you could bring out all sorts of clashes among them. This is what Arnold does, thereby making people look much more irrational than they are in actuality. So this is the move that cable TV hosts make, where they say the left or the right is inconsistent. They want this. Some of them say it's for this. Some of them say it's for that. Make up your mind. Why is this good? So what they do is they make it appear as if everyone's approaching it from one perspective on the issue, rather than the fact that they all agree on the issue, and they may even agree on what part of the political spectrum they're on. But the reasons for supporting that idea come from their various perspectives. So the problem with debunking is it pushes people into unrealistic modes of thinking. When we speak and when we offer opinions, it's always from a perspective, and it always comes from a point of view or a different rationale, because everyone makes up their different rationale. He assembles this group with reference to an interest they have in common, but when interpreting the motivation behind their pronouncements, he drops the test of interests, by which he has selected his sitters for a composite portrait, and attributes their pronouncements instead to a love of ritual, ceremony, of parade. So this is a common tactic that debunkers do, where you bring everybody together on an interest of packing the court, but then instead of saying that that's what brought them together, then you flip and you say actually what brings them together is their love of liberal policies, their love of tax and spend, their love of restricting women's rights, or whatever you want it to be, instead of looking at what it is that the interests of that perspective brought them to support that. And I think you can defeat an argument better in a way to where you actually open up a way to move forward by not debunking. Debunking is when you flip it here and you say it's not the interest that brought them together. They're brought together by this other weird love or weird unified thing, and that's why they want to do the thing. And it's exploited here for polemic, pamphleteering purposes. Resides in the fact that he simultaneously employs and discards the factor of interest in putting the group together on interest, and then sliding this interest as an interpretation of their statements. So instead of taking conservative or liberal statements as their rationale for the support of it, they say it's not the issue that brought them together. What brought them together is liberalism or conservatism. And then when you look at what they say, it looks contradictory because they're all there together because they're on the right or they're on the left. And this is very dangerous because it eliminates the way for argument to sort of function to bring up new ideas and new perspectives that we wouldn't be able to come up with on our own. That's my interpretation. I don't think Burke says that per se, but we're about to get to the end of this thing, and we'll see what he says. So this is another good part here. A man, to reach his destination, goes up the street one day. The next day it's raining, so he reaches his destination by going down the street to the corner where the bus stops. Now imagine a thinker who said to them, yesterday you went up the street, today you go down the street. What inconsistency? And he might answer by saying, well, look at my interests in each case. And looking, you would find no inconsistency whatsoever. It was raining. I didn't want to get wet. The same is true in a more complex way of arguments that discuss policies in terms of principles. You advocate a policy by relating it to a different principle than you would select when attacking the policy. Right? So businesses are the example here where they talk about insecurity as a bad business environment, but then they talk about security as something that the businesses need. He builds up a picture of a fabulously irrational world by juxtaposing the shifts from up the street to down the street, meaning out matters of destination and intended circumstance, attributing the thought of his opponents to sheer irrational penchant for ritual. So that's the problem with the book, but you know other places where this happens. If you pay attention to the news, if you've read something, where instead of looking at circumstance and destination, they say, look at the contradictions here. Look how inconsistent my opponent is. Look how inconsistent the liberals are. Look how inconsistent the conservatives are. So here he is critiquing the book some more. And there's nothing wrong, he says, with the idea of ritual, which is a part of the book. This kind of goes into a lot of detail I don't really want to get into here because he's kind of attacking the book per se. Let's see, what's the next part? Here's a good part. I like this part here. Of late, we've been hearing so much criticism of government by blueprints. This would be government by making a blueprint for what society would look like, right? Abstract ideals, I submit, are social blueprints. They are ways of shaping policies with relation to principles. So if you say, we don't need government by blueprints, let's have government by ideals, well, you're really debunking there. You're suggesting a kind of a blueprint, right? They're ways of shaping policies with relation to principles. They select measures with reference to directives. Go 2 blocks north and then take 1 block east. The 2 blocks and 1 block are the policy, and the north and east are the principles. That makes a lot of sense if you think about it. So if our principle is protecting people, and then we want to offer socialized medicine, like national health care, we want to offer a strong army, big defense weapon spending, or we want to offer very strict voter registration requirements. All these things would be policies that we could defend by saying the role of government is to protect people. But the debunker would come in and say, no, the role of government isn't to protect people. That's stupid. The government shouldn't be a nanny state. It shouldn't protect people. What it should do instead is protect the Constitution. Or what it should do instead is provide a fair, what do they call it? An equal playing field, opportunity for people. It should provide equal opportunity instead. And what Burke is saying is that debunking mode misses the point of the heart of it, which should be the debate about the policies and the perspective together in terms of what is really doing well based on circumstances and situation. And sharing all these things get us into a much better place to determine policy. He talks about comfort here. And then he wants to talk about humanitarianism. This is important. Let's talk about this paragraph here that I've marked. I believe that humanitarianism can also be singled out as an integral aspect of the debunking strategy. For unless the thinker is totally antisocial, humanitarian elements must be engrafted upon modes of thinking that attribute human actions to motives low in the scale of values. The typical debunker might write a book to prove, for instance, that all people are crooks, right? That's a very kind of, everybody's a thief, everybody wants to steal and take, and they're selfish. The logical conclusion from such a book would be, so let's try to cheat them before they cheat us. But the humanitarian afterthought, which makes it not look like debunking, is usually added to the thesis. Out of nowhere comes a corrective that seems to say, let's try to help them not to be crooks and not to be the victims of crooks. So then he starts talking about William James and philosophy and Peirce and all this kind of stuff. and goes deeply into philosophy that he assumes you've read. And it's kind of like a fixing of the end of it, instead of being like caught in kind of a depressive spiral of darkness. You put a little humanitarian twist on the end to say, well, actually, let's just be for good power, not evil power, kind of at the end, right? And then he talks about Shakespeare, which you might be familiar with, and that example might be a good one for you. The alternative to the debunker is this non-humanitarian ideal of truth. It would be a weird perspective whereby the expository and the hortatory were contained in one. So, but as the debunker, you must make a distinction between himself as a scientific expositor or diagnostician and himself as a civic personality. So he always has to have these divisions. So one of the signs of the debunker is somebody who has to stand outside of humanity and sort of comment on it in this way that is standing above, kind of like a weird researcher would, which is kind of strange. Burke says. Might be something you think is actually a pretty good approach. So let's get into, most of the stuff is particularly about the Arnold book that he's critiquing. This distinction between the citizen truth and the scientific truth. The citizen must lie about in order to act on any political idea, whether right, center, or left, is obvious in a state like ours, where there are extreme conflicts of interest. A government that seeks to mediate somewhat along these conflicts must adopt measures somewhat at odds with each other. So this is this perception that we have to have consistency in our thinking. But must we leap from this to the conclusion that the whole basis of rationality must be swept away? So some people tend to think that because there's inconsistency in political argument, that rationality is not present in the other side. Is there a way that you can address it and preserve that kind of position? And do we need to burn everything down and say that a position is irrational because that position has elements that shift or are contradictory in some way? I personally contend there's no need for such statement as the case as Arnold presents. There's no need for the humanitarian afterthought at all. So the humanitarian afterthought is like, yes, people might be crooks, they might be evil, people might be terrible and selfish, but let's work hard to teach them not to be. We need to teach people how not to be jerks. We need to teach people how not to be, even though people might be racist, we must teach them how to not be racist instead of just accepting it, right? Which is both debunking. He says we don't need this at all. There was no need for such statement of the case as Arnold presents. There's no need for the humanitarian afterthought at all, making for the kind of breach between exposition and exhortation that offers you a true picture of mankind and then tells you must act on a different illusory picture. So this is for people who claim that something is inevitable on human nature, and then we have to work hard to teach people not to be that way. People are hateful beings and selfish. Let's work hard to not make them that way. It doesn't make a lot of sense at all, right? There's no need for all this overt throwing out and covert taking back, which is what that is. So here's the kind of argument that Burke wants us to have. People, taken by and large, are acting reasonably enough within their frame of reference. Aha. Now that's interesting because you can see connections of that with Ehninger from the last stuff we read about how Ehninger says that the very first thing that we have to have in argumentation is a respect of humanity between people. This frame of reference may not be large enough to encompass all the important factors operating today. Hence, they need a still wider frame of reference. So their experience might not be enough to be able to judge on whether their actions are reasonable. Take a wider frame of reference, not the truth, but a wider frame of reference. Admittedly, those who would uphold the status quo and have a grip upon the channels of information and instruction will make the establishment of a wider frame of reference quite difficult, perhaps even impossible. But that is no ground for asking that we try to drop the whole attempt, substituting a purely cameralistic point of view towards administrative problems. It is precisely because our adepts at organizational activities have run into difficulties, precisely because the organizations do not fit properly with one another, that we must seek some more comprehensive rationale for discussing the situation in its broader aspects and adopting measures accordingly. So instead of getting hyper narrow and hyper specific on what the truth of the human condition is, Burke suggests that we just have continuously expanding frames of reference and not worry about what something actually is, and then eliminate that, which is what debunkers do. So then he says that towards the end of this Arnold book, he actually tries to reach this point. He actually does a little bit better than that, right? So, he wants to make scientific diagnosis and moral exhortation integral aspects of one program. So then he talks about his own little humanitarian ending here to the book. So most of this is just kind of the review of the Arnold book. So what do we get out of this kind of quick? It's not really a deep reading of it, but what do we understand Burke's idea of argument to be? What do we understand him to be talking about here? I think I need to bring up our Word document again so we can see if we can answer these questions. How would you answer these questions? Maybe some potential answers to try to understand the essay is debunking is when you totally take out an opposition argument to the point where there is no space for you to argue any good from that position. Maybe that's a way to define it. I'm going to put a question mark there. You'll probably come up with your own definition of what debunking is. It seems like when you say that you make a kind of an essentialist claim about humanity or about the government or something. I really like the one where you say, no, the government isn't about protecting people. It's about giving people opportunity, as if those things were somehow absolutely divergent, right? And there wasn't any way you could accept the government to protect people. So what does Burke think argumentation is? Well, he did talk about at the end there, frames of reference, perspective in context. Remember the interests part, where he talks about the interests of the guy going up the street to catch the bus one day, down the street the next day to catch the bus. Perspective and context. So argumentation is like, why did you go up the street when going down the street is best? Well, look to my context. Look at what I was trying to do. I didn't want to get wet. It was raining. I went the shorter way. Oh, okay, well, that makes sense. Instead of saying anybody who goes down the street is an idiot because it's the longer way. Or whatever, right? There might be some better way to evaluate it. Things aren't obvious in terms of what perspective is best. So argumentation's frames of reference, perspective, and context. And I think he's trying to say that it gives humans a powerful interpretive device for addressing conflict, problems, etc. in organizations like the government. I think that's what he's talking about. I don't know. You might have something else to say, but these are the things I got out of looking at it with you here on this video today. Okay, how do we avoid debunking? What practices can we take for good argumentation from this essay? Perhaps, instead of trying to think about, we want to avoid some essential in our attacks, maybe. We want to consider perspective and context in arguments always, maybe more than being right. Maybe we should say avoid essentialism in our attacks, maybe not some essentialism. I mean, there might be some strategic need to essentialize some parts of an argument, but it's hard to think about that in terms of the essay that we just read. But I'm just kind of thinking a little bit beyond that. But I think the idea of saying that all people, all governments, all politicians, all tax cuts are, we want to avoid that to avoid debunking. Consider perspective and context in arguments. And I think we need to recognize that placing supposed contradictory perspectives in concert, that means working together, can lead to some interesting perspectives on the issues that we argue about. So maybe those are some things we can take away from this essay. Again, this essay is really interesting because even though it was written in the late 1930s, it speaks to us in a way that I think is really relevant for our contemporary political situation and brings out a lot of the troubles, a lot of the kinds of issues that we have when we're talking about politics today. So see if you can practice this. See if you can practice this kind of anti-debunking. You don't want to be a debunker. Debunking's too easy, and it's necessitated by a force of the speed of constant barrage of arguments by the side of the political spectrum you don't like. That constant barrage of arguments of this is doom and gloom, doom and gloom, doom and gloom. This is going to happen if we don't act. Our values are eroding. Look at the statistics of gun violence. All this stuff just beating down on you. You're going to want to address that stuff. And one way of addressing it is to say, oh, that's any study like this doesn't give us the whole picture. Or that's just the opinion of SJWs or something like that, where you just completely debunk the other side and don't allow them the position to make any argument at all, or don't allow any of that information to be considered argumentative. You eliminate any possible potential good that you could find in there by saying, well, contextually, that's their point of view, but let's examine the issue in some other way. A lot of these issues are very important. We don't want to burn down all of the argumentative ground for addressing them by completely eliminating the other side's existence, which is our initial temptation, is to just take them out. They don't have anything to say. Let's wipe them out. And instead think about something where we try to actually combine these things, because the reasons that people support a policy are not based on that policy's political position, but based on their frame of reference. So if we argue with frame of reference first, we're going to have much better forms of argument. I think that's what Burke is saying. So I hope you like this read through. Let me know what questions you have about debunking. And just let me know in Discord, or let me know on email or whatever, and I'll help you understand the essay.